Paris at midnight is not the same city tourists know. The streets may be quiet, but inside the Élysée Palace, the tension is heavy. Files marked urgent cover the tables. Advisors whisper about troop withdrawals, lost contracts, and leaders in West Africa who no longer answer French calls. France cannot sleep because the Sahel Alliance, once dismissed as a fragile experiment, is now growing stronger and beginning to reach beyond Africa's borders. The alliance began with 3 nations, many in the West considered weak: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Under leaders tours who share both a military background and a vision of sovereignty, these countries united after years of coups, sanctions, and foreign pressure. Their first goal was survival, to resist outside control and reclaim authority over their own land. But in less than 2 years, the Sahel Alliance has transformed into something far more dangerous for the old order, a model that other nations are now watching carefully. For France, this is a nightmare. The country once held vast colonies across Africa, and even after independence, it maintained influence through currency systems, trade deals, and military bases. That influence is now hurting. French troops have been asked to leave. French companies are losing access to mines and contracts. Even the CFA franc, the currency long tied to Paris, is being questioned. The worry does not end in Africa. Rumors now spread that countries in Latin America and even Asia are considering closer ties with the Sahel bloc. Russia and China have already signaled support, seeing the alliance as a wedge against Western dominance. If nations outside Africa begin to align with Traoré's vision, the balance of global power could shift in ways unseen since the end of the Cold War. This is why France lies awake at night. The question is no longer whether the Sahel Alliance can survive, but whether it can grow into a movement powerful enough to challenge centuries of Western dominance. If you have ever wondered how quickly the world can change, stay with us, because what is happening in the Sahel today may decide the course of tomorrow's history. At first, the Sahel Alliance was dismissed as little more than a gesture. Western analysts called it a marriage of weakness, a pact formed by 3 landlocked nations with fragile economies and histories of coups. Yet what many failed to see was that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had tapped into something much larger than themselves: the hunger of entire continents for sovereignty. The early months of the alliance focused on security. Joint patrols along porous borders aimed to drive out insurgent groups and reclaim territory. Villagers in northern Burkina Faso, who once lived in fear of raids, began to see soldiers from different nations cooperating side by side. A farmer named Adama told a local radio station, "For years, we only saw foreign troops, and they never protected us. Now when I see our own people patrolling together, I feel Africa is waking up." His words captured a growing sentiment. This was not just about defense, it was about identity. The real surprise came when the alliance announced plans to expand beyond the Sahel. Guinea was the first African country to show interest. Its leaders, long vocal against French dominance of the CFA franc, saw in the alliance a chance to escape financial dependency. Negotiations for Guinea's membership are still underway, but the symbolism of its move was powerful. France could no longer dismiss the alliance as an isolated desert experiment. What shook Paris even more were the unexpected overtures from Latin America. In Caracas, Venezuelan officials praised the alliance's defiance and hinted at barter deals: African gold in exchange for Venezuelan oil. In La Paz, Bolivia's leaders spoke of joining forces in the fight against resource exploitation, proposing joint projects in lithium and agriculture. For the first time, an African bloc was reaching across the Atlantic, drawing connections with nations who had their own struggles with U.S. and European influence. Russia and China quickly stepped in, offering diplomatic recognition and material support. Beijing proposed infrastructure deals to link the capitals of the alliance with railroads and fiber optic cables, while Moscow offered discounted arms and military training. To Western policymakers, this was confirmation of their worst fears. The Sahel Alliance was becoming a node in a larger network designed to erode Western power. The expansion was not only economic or military, it was ideological. In Ouagadougou, a historic summit was held where leaders from Africa, Latin America, and Asia gathered. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, holding a copy of Burkina Faso's constitution in one hand and raising his fist with the other. "The Sahel Alliance is not simply an African project," he declared. "It is an invitation to every nation that chooses dignity over dependency." His words echoed through the hall, met with thunderous applause. Delegates from countries as far away as Cuba and Iran nodded in approval. Plans for a Sahel Development Bank were unveiled at the same meeting. Unlike the IMF or World Bank, this institution would be funded by gold reserves and local currencies, designed to lend money without political strings attached. For small nations long trapped in cycles of debt, this idea was revolutionary. It promised loans for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure without conditions that demanded austerity or foreign control. Even leaders in Asia, quietly observing from afar, began to wonder whether this model could spread. For France, the expansion felt like a geopolitical earthquake. Newspapers in Paris ran headlines such as "The Sahel slips away" and "A new alliance threatens Europe's future." Then editorials described sleepless nights in the Élysée Palace, where officials debated sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or covert action. Yet for the people of the Sahel, this was a season of hope. In Bamako, families celebrated by singing old independence songs. In Niamey, schoolchildren painted murals of African leaders standing shoulder to shoulder. One young student, Mariam, expressed the mood of her generation. "We grew up hearing that Africa was too weak to lead. Now with the alliance, we see that our continent is not only surviving, it is teaching the world how to resist." The expansion of the Sahel Alliance has already begun to reshape how global power is measured. What was once a fragile regional pact is now building bridges across oceans, drawing the attention of powers both sympathetic and hostile. But with growth comes danger. As the alliance spreads beyond Africa, it is not only inspiring allies, but also provoking powerful adversaries. The question now is clear. What happens when France, the European Union, and even the United States decide that this young movement has gone too far? The climax of this story came during an extraordinary summit in Ouagadougou. Representatives from Africa, Latin America, and Asia filled the hall, their flags draped side by side. For the first time in modern history, leaders of nations once described as peripheral stood together and spoke of building a center of power of their own. At the heart of it all was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. Wearing his red beret and military uniform, he stepped to the podium and delivered a speech that electrified the room. "We will no longer be divided," he declared. "Our resources are not the property of outsiders. Our future will not be dictated from Paris, Washington, or Brussels." The Sahel Alliance is not just for Africa. It is for all nations who choose sovereignty. The hall erupted in applause. Delegates from Mali and Niger rose to their feet. Representatives from Guinea and Venezuela shook hands. Cameras captured the moment, and within hours, the images spread across social media platforms worldwide. In the streets of Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in celebration. Miners who had spent their lives working for foreign companies danced to drums, waving small nuggets of gold as symbols of freedom. Shopkeepers closed early to join parades, while students painted murals on city walls showing Africa linked to Latin America with bridges of gold. For ordinary people, it felt like the independence movements of the past had returned, only this time with the potential to succeed. The reactions abroad were immediate and intense. In Paris, the French press called Traoré's speech a declaration of economic war. Politicians demanded urgent action, from sanctions to stronger ties with African states still loyal to France. One lawmaker warned, "If we allow this bloc to grow, we may lose Africa for good." The sense of panic was unmistakable. In Washington, the mood was more cautious, but no less concerned. Analysts at the State Department noted that while the alliance was still small, its ability to attract partners beyond Africa made it dangerous. A classified memo leaked to the press stated, "The Sahel Alliance has the potential to reshape global supply chains, particularly in gold and energy. Its rhetoric challenges not only French influence, but the stability of the dollar itself." And for many Americans who still remembered the oil shocks of the 1970s, this was a chilling warning. Russia and China reacted with open enthusiasm. Russian state television called the summit a turning point in the battle against neo-colonialism. Chinese media praised the talk of infrastructure projects that would link the Sahel to Asia. Both nations recognized that this new bloc could serve as a powerful partner in their own rivalry with the West. For Moscow and Beijing, Traoré was not a threat, but an opportunity. Not every reaction was positive, even within Africa. Leaders in countries with close ties to Europe worried that joining the alliance might trigger economic retaliation. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, remained hesitant, balancing between the appeal of sovereignty and the fear of sanctions. South Africa, while sympathetic, chose to wait and see whether the Sahel bloc could endure. Among ordinary citizens, however, the symbolism of the summit outweighed political caution. In churches across Ghana and mosques in Senegal, sermons spoke of dignity and independence. In Latin America, activists who had long criticized U.S. policies hailed the Sahel Alliance as proof that resistance could work. In online forums, people began to use the phrase, "a new non-alignment," recalling the Cold War era, but with a modern twist. The climax revealed a startling truth. The Sahel Alliance was no longer an experiment. It had become a movement. The cheers of citizens in Burkina Faso contrasted sharply with the anxiety in Paris and Washington. One could feel the collision of hope and fear, pride and panic, sovereignty and control. The question hanging in the air was stark. Could this fragile coalition of poor nations really challenge centuries of Western dominance? Or would the backlash from powerful adversaries crush it before it truly took root? As the summit closed, one reporter whispered, "If France cannot sleep tonight, what will happen when the United States wakes up tomorrow?" In Burkina Faso, the expansion of the Sahel Alliance quickly spilled into daily life. Markets in Ouagadougou buzzed with debate. Some traders worried that sanctions from Europe could make imports more expensive, while others believed the alliance would finally give local producers a chance to compete fairly. A cloth seller named Awa shared her fears with a journalist, saying, "If prices rise, people like me will suffer first. But if the alliance gives us freedom, perhaps my children will not have to live under the same chains." Her words reflected the dual emotions felt across the country: anxiety about the present and cautious hope for the future. In rural areas, the atmosphere was more optimistic. Farmers who had long felt ignored by governments in Paris or Washington now saw soldiers from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger patrolling together to protect their villages. A farmer named Yusuf explained that bandits had once stolen his cattle with impunity. Now, joint patrols had restored some sense of safety. Before, outsiders promised to protect us, but nothing changed, he said. Now I see our own people working together, and I believe change is real. Politically, the alliance ignited fierce debate inside Burkina Faso. Supporters praised Traoré as a visionary leader who was reclaiming Africa's dignity. His image appeared on murals, posters, and even school notebooks. He was portrayed not only as a soldier, but as a liberator, standing against centuries of exploitation. Yet opposition voices grew louder as well. Critics warned that Burkina Faso risked becoming too dependent on Russia or China, replacing one form of foreign influence with another. Some accused Traoré of silencing dissent, arguing that unity must not come at the cost of democracy. In Mali and Niger, similar debates unfolded. Citizens celebrated new agreements that promised to channel gold, uranium, and agricultural products into the alliance's development bank. For families who had watched their resources exported with little return, this felt revolutionary. But others asked whether their fragile economies could withstand the inevitable pressure from the West. Tensions rose in parliaments, and leaders faced pressure to prove that bold speeches would translate into real progress. Religious leaders across the Sahel sought to guide their communities through the uncertainty. In mosques, imams reminded worshippers that every path to freedom demands sacrifice. In churches, pastors urged patience and faith, telling stories of biblical figures who endured trials before victory. This spiritual guidance helped calm fears, but it also reinforced the idea that the struggle for sovereignty was not merely political, but moral. Beyond the Sahel, the ripple effects were significant. In Ghana and Nigeria, student groups organized rallies calling on their governments to join the alliance. In Senegal, opposition parties used the rise of the bloc to criticize their leaders for remaining too close to France. Across Africa, ordinary people began to see the Sahel not as a troubled region, but as a pioneer of resistance. For France, the civil and political consequences were alarming. French businesses reported contract losses in mining and energy sectors. French-language media outlets found their influence shrinking as African journalists promoted narratives of sovereignty. Even cultural ties, once considered unbreakable, began to weaken. Musicians and writers in Bamako and Ouagadougou spoke proudly of a future in which African art was no longer defined by Parisian approval. The expansion also raised questions within the African Union. Some leaders feared that embracing the alliance would fracture the continent, dividing states between pro-Western and pro-sovereignty camps. Others argued that the alliance could be the seed of true continental independence. Heated debates erupted at AU meetings, with diplomats struggling to balance tradition, pragmatism, and the desire for change. For ordinary families across the Sahel, However, the consequences were deeply personal. Some faced rising costs as imports became uncertain. Others found new hope in local industries and cooperative farming projects supported by alliance funds. For a young student in Bamako, the question was simple. If this alliance can give me a job at home, I will stay. If not, I will risk the sea to Europe. The civil and political consequences revealed a stark truth. The Sahel Alliance was no longer just a matter of high-level diplomacy. It was shaping the lives of millions, forcing them to weigh hardship against dignity, fear against pride, uncertainty against hope. But as families across Africa adapt to this new reality, powerful forces outside the continent are preparing their own responses. How will the United States, the European Union, and other global powers react to a movement that dares to expand beyond Africa's borders? In Washington, the rise of the Sahel Alliance has been met with growing unease. At the State Department, officials describe the bloc as symbolic in size, but dangerous in meaning. While Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not major economic powers, the example they are setting and the partnerships they are building beyond Africa trouble U.S. policymakers. For decades, the dollar and Western institutions anchored global trade and finance. Now reports warn that if Latin American or Asian partners align with the alliance, those foundations could begin to weaken. Think tanks across the capital compare the situation to the oil crisis of the 1970s. Back then, American families felt the shock of long gas lines and soaring prices. Today, the fear is not about oil supplies, but about the slow creation of a new financial network built on gold and strategic resources. Such a system would reduce reliance on the dollar and shift trade away from Western oversight. One leaked memo from an economic advisory group stated plainly that the Sahel Alliance may be small in numbers, but it is planting the seeds of an alternative order. France has been the loudest in its reaction. French leaders speak openly of betrayal and the loss of influence in a region once considered central to their national strategy. Newspapers in Paris warn of a geopolitical collapse if the alliance continues to attract members. Calls for sanctions grow stronger, yet the European Union remains divided. Some argue that punishing the Sahel will only push it further toward Russia and China, while others believe firm action is needed to defend European interests. Moscow and Beijing have seized the moment. Russian media celebrate Ibrahim Traoré as a defender of sovereignty. Chinese diplomats quietly discuss partnerships in mining, energy, and infrastructure. For both powers, the alliance is seen as a natural ally in their broader challenge to Western dominance. Inside the United States, the story has also found an audience. African American churches and community groups hold forums linking the Sahel's push for independence to long struggles for dignity and equality. For some, it represents a chance to reconnect with Africa on terms of respect rather than charity. The Sahel Alliance has therefore sparked a debate far larger than itself. Is it a temporary protest destined to fade under pressure, or the first sign of a realignment that could shake the pillars of Western power? The answer may not come from Paris or Washington, but from the determination of ordinary people in the Sahel who refuse to let their dream of sovereignty die. France cannot sleep because the Sahel Alliance has become more than a regional pact. It is a statement of resistance that now reaches across oceans. For the first time in generations, the heart of Africa is no longer bowing to outside control, but standing as an example for others to follow. The consequences are profound. If this bloc survives the storms ahead, It could alter the balance of global power in ways that Paris, Washington, and Brussels never expected. The risks are undeniable. Sanctions could raise the cost of food and medicine for ordinary families. Diplomatic pressure might isolate the governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Retaliation could spark new conflicts in a region already scarred by war, yet the hope is equally powerful. If the alliance continues to expand, it could build a network of nations trading in their own currencies, funding their own development banks, and defending their own sovereignty without waiting for approval from the West. History shows that no empire lasts forever. The British Empire once dominated global trade before losing its crown to the United States. Today, the Western-led order faces its own test. The Sahel Alliance may not destroy it overnight, but it has already shown that small nations with determination can challenge systems once thought untouchable. For the people of the Sahel, this struggle is not theoretical. It is about whether their children will grow up under the shadow of dependency or under the light of independence. For families in America watching from afar, it is a reminder that global shifts abroad can touch their own lives at home, just as the oil shocks of the past once did. So the question remains, will the Sahel Alliance be remembered as a bold experiment that collapsed under pressure, or as the spark that ignited a new global awakening? If this story has stirred reflection in your heart, share your thoughts. If you believe that dignity, justice, and sovereignty belong to all peoples, let your voice be part of this conversation. And as always, may God bless Africa, may He bless America, and may He guide us toward a future where freedom is not granted by the powerful, but claimed by the people.